In the heart of Lagos, where towers of glass and steel pierced the African sky like monuments to ambition, there lived a man who believed he had conquered everything worth conquering. Chief Adeyemi Ogunlade was his name, and at 52 years old, he sat atop an empire built from oil, real estate, and the calculated manipulation of every opportunity that crossed his path. His mansion in Ikoyi sprawled across 3 acres of manicured perfection, marble fountains that never stopped flowing, golden gates that required 4 men to open, and chandeliers imported from Venice that cost more than most Nigerians would earn in 10 lifetimes. But on this particular morning, as dawn broke over the Atlantic and painted his study in shades of amber and blood orange, Chief Adeyemi sat hunched over his mahogany desk with trembling hands, staring at documents that represented the culmination of everything he had worked for. A $1,000 million oil partnership with European investors that would cement his legacy as the most powerful businessman in West Africa. Yet the papers blurred before his eyes, and the trembling in his fingers had nothing to do with excitement. 6 months, the doctor had told him 3 weeks ago. 6 months, unless they found a donor with his rare blood type, a genetic anomaly so uncommon that his team had searched through every hospital registry in Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa without success. The irony was not lost on him. A man who could buy anything, who had spent his entire life accumulating wealth and influence, was now powerless against the failing machinery of his own body. His wife slept in a separate wing of the mansion, their marriage long since reduced to a business arrangement of appearances and social climbing. His children lived abroad, calling only when they needed money, their voices hollow, with the entitled indifference of those who had never known struggle. And so, Chief Adeyemi sat alone in his empire of gold, realizing with growing horror that he had built a kingdom with no one to mourn him when he was gone. Across the city, in the servants' quarters of a diplomat's residence in Victoria Island, a different kind of mourning was unfolding. Amara woke at 4:30, as she did every day, her body trained by years of necessity to function on 5 hours of sleep. The room she shared with her 7-year-old daughter Zara was barely large enough for 2 narrow beds and a wooden trunk that held everything they owned. But it was clean, and it was safe, and for that, Amara whispered a prayer of gratitude, as she had been taught by her grandmother in the village she had left behind so many years ago. At 28, Amara carried herself with a dignity that made people wonder about her past. There was something in her posture, in the careful way she chose her words, that suggested she had not always been someone who scrubbed other people's floors. She had been a university student once, studying to become a nurse, before circumstances she never spoke about had derailed those dreams and left her alone with a child to raise and no family support to cushion the fall. Now she worked for Madame Folak, the diplomat's wife, a woman whose cruelty was refined and casual, delivered in cutting remarks about Amara's worn shoes or the way she tied her head wrap, reminders carefully designed to ensure Amara never forgot her place in the hierarchy of this household. As she moved through the pre-dawn darkness to prepare breakfast, Amara paused at Zara's bed and watched her daughter sleep. The child's face, peaceful, innocent, unaware of the weight her mother carried daily to give her a chance at something better. Zara had her father's nose and her mother's fierce spirit, though Amara never spoke of the man who had abandoned them before Zara learned to walk. The little girl was brilliant, curious, with a habit of asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. Questions about fairness, about why some people had so much, while others had so little, about whether God really listened to everyone's prayers, or just the ones spoken in big churches. Amara loved her daughter, with a ferocity that frightened her sometimes, a love so consuming that she would gladly have endured twice the humiliation, twice the exhaustion, if it meant Zara could grow up with opportunities Amara herself had lost. The phone call that would change everything happened just after noon, when the Lagos heat had turned the city into a shimmering mirage, and most sensible people had retreated into air-conditioned spaces to wait out the worst of it. Madame Folaka had left for her weekly spa appointment, taking with her the usual atmosphere of tense surveillance that permeated the house whenever she was present. Amara was in the kitchen preparing lunch, and Zara was supposed to be doing homework at the small table in the servants' corridor. But the child had wandered into the main house, something strictly forbidden, but impossible to prevent, when a 7-year-old's curiosity proved stronger than her mother's warnings. The landline in the sitting room began to ring, its shrill tone cutting through the afternoon stillness, and Zara, who had been examining a crystal vase and wondering how something so fragile could cost more than her entire school fees, walked over to the phone with the innocent assumption that phones existed to be answered. On the other end of that line, Chief Adeyemi Ogunlade was in his car, being driven through Lagos traffic to yet another meeting with doctors who would tell him things he did not want to hear. His secretary had finally secured a contact at a private medical coordination agency, a last resort, a final hope, and had dialed the number from her notes, not noticing that her hurried handwriting had transposed 2 digits, sending the call not to a sterile office in Ikeja, but to a diplomat's residence, where a maid's daughter was lifting a phone receiver that weighed heavy in her small hands. When Zara said hello, her voice carrying that particular musical quality of childhood innocence, Chief Adeyemi's first response was irritation. He had no patience for mistakes, no tolerance for incompetence, and certainly no time for whatever domestic situation had resulted in a child answering what was supposed to be a critical professional call. His voice came through the line like a thunderclap, deep and imperious, carrying the weight of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "This is Chief Adeyemi Ogunlade, calling about medical case file 4471. I need immediate confirmation on the blood registry search. This is a $1,000 million priority matter. Transfer me to your supervisor immediately." Zara stood frozen, the phone pressed against her ear, understanding perhaps 1 word in 5, but recognizing the tone of authority and urgency that made her instinctively look around for her mother. Amara appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening in horror as she saw Zara with the forbidden phone, and she crossed the distance in 3 swift strides, taking the receiver from her daughter's hands, while mouthing a fierce, "I told you never to touch this," that promised consequences later. But when Amara lifted the phone to her own ear and heard the voice identifying itself, Chief Adeyemi Ogunlade, something inside her went very still and very cold. That name. She knew that name. It lived in her memory like a scar that had healed over, but never quite faded, attached to a night 15 years ago that she had tried so hard to forget, and yet could recall with perfect clarity whenever she closed her eyes. Her voice, when she finally spoke, came out barely above a whisper. "Sir, I apologize. There has been a mistake. This is not a medical office. This is a private residence." The explosion that followed was immediate and volcanic. Chief Adeyemi, already on edge from weeks of bad news and failed searches, unleashed a torrent of fury about incompetence and wasted time, and whether she had any idea what she had just cost him. He did not wait for a response. The line went dead with a click that sounded like a door slamming shut, and Amara stood there holding the silent phone, her hands shaking so badly that Zara reached up to touch her arm with concern. "Mama, why are you crying?" the little girl asked. and Amara realized she was indeed crying, tears running down her face without permission, because hearing that name had ripped open a part of her past she had sealed away, a memory that carried with it both profound meaning and profound pain. The memory came flooding back with the force of a monsoon rain, washing away 15 years in an instant and returning Amara to a night when she had been a different person, living a different life. She had been 23 then, a third-year nursing student at the University of Ibadan, home in her village for the semester break, and helping her grandmother prepare for a cousin's wedding. The village sat alongside one of those rural highways that connected major cities, but saw little maintenance and less traffic after dark. And that particular night, Amara had been walking back from a friend's house when she heard the sound, metal tearing, glass shattering, the horrible percussion of violence that registers in the body before the mind can name it. She found the car, 30 meters from the road, wrapped around a thick mahogany tree, its front end accordioned into something barely recognizable as a vehicle. The driver was dead instantly, his body still trapped behind the wheel. But there was a passenger who had been thrown partially from the car, a young man in an expensive suit, now torn and soaked with blood. He was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound that looked catastrophic, and Amara's first instinct was to run for help. But her training kicked in before her fear could win. She had just completed an intensive first aid course, and the instructor's voice echoed in her mind. You assess, you stabilize, you save. She used her headscarf, a beautiful Ankara print her grandmother had given her that morning, to create pressure on the wound. She checked his airway, his pulse, his breathing. She stayed with him for 3 hours in the darkness, keeping him alive through sheer will and whatever medical knowledge she possessed, until finally someone else came down that road, and she could send them to find help. When the ambulance arrived, when the police came with their questions and their clipboards, Amara slipped away. She did not want attention or praise, or the complicated entanglement of a rural girl being connected to what was clearly a wealthy man's accident. She went home, washed the blood from her hands, and tried to forget. But weeks later, her uncle showed her a newspaper article about Adeyemi Ogunlade, a rising business magnate who had survived a terrible crash that killed his driver, saved by an unknown Good Samaritan who had vanished before anyone could thank her properly. Amara had kept that article, she did not know why, folded into her Bible where it had stayed, through all the years that followed. Through her having to drop out of university when her grandmother died and the family money evaporated. Through her brief, ill-fated relationship with Zara's father. Through the slow descent from hopeful student to struggling single mother to housemaid. For 3 days after that phone call, Amara existed in a state of suspended decision, torn between the overwhelming urge to reach out to Chief Adeyemi and the equally powerful fear of being dismissed as an opportunist or fraud. She played out conversations in her mind while she mopped floors, imagining how she might explain herself, what proof she could offer, whether he would even remember the accident with enough clarity to verify her story. Meanwhile, her situation at the diplomat's residence grew more precarious. Madame Folaki had discovered that Zara had answered the house phone. The neighbor's gardener had mentioned seeing the child through the window, and had erupted with such theatrical fury that one might have thought Zara had burned the house down rather than simply picked up a receiver. Amara had begged for forgiveness, had prostrated herself in the traditional way, had promised it would never happen again. But Madame Folake's eyes had glittered with the particular pleasure some people take in exercising power over those who cannot fight back. You have 1 week to find new employment, she had announced, her voice dripping with false regret. I simply cannot have staff who cannot control their children or follow basic household rules. 1 week, 7 days to find another position in a city where thousands of women were competing for the same handful of housemaid jobs, where every application required references and documentation, and the kind of social connections Amara had lost when she fell from her previous life. She spent her evenings after Zara went to sleep, sitting on her narrow bed, staring at that old newspaper article she had retrieved from her Bible, running her fingers over the faded text as if it might provide answers. And finally, on the fourth day, she made a decision born of desperation and courage in equal measure. Through a woman she knew from church, who had a cousin who worked in the business district, Amara managed to get a phone number for Chief Adeyemi's corporate office. She left a message with a secretary who sounded bored and skeptical. "Please tell Chief Ogunlade that the woman who saved his life on the Ibadan highway in 2010 needs to speak with him. Her name is Amara. It's important. It's about the blood registry." She did not know if the message would ever reach him. She did not know if he would believe it if it did. But she had spoken the truth into the void. And sometimes, when you have nothing left, speaking truth is the only power you possess. 2 days passed with no response, and Amara began to accept that her attempt had failed, that she would be jobless by week's end, that she and Zara would have to return to her village with nothing to show for 5 years in Lagos, except exhaustion and diminished dreams. She was packing their few possessions into cardboard boxes when Zara came running from the main house, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. "Mama, Mama, there are big cars outside, men in black suits. Madame Folick is acting very strange." Amara's first thought was that the diplomat had returned unexpectedly, but when she emerged from the servants' quarters and saw the convoy of black SUVs parked in the circular driveway, saw the security men in dark glasses speaking into earpieces, saw Madame Folick standing on the front steps with an expression caught between outrage and confusion, she knew immediately who had come. Chief Adeyemi Ogunlade stepped from the middle vehicle with the kind of presence that seemed to bend reality around him. Tall, imposing, dressed in traditional agbada that probably cost more than a year of Amara's wages, moving with the unconscious authority of someone who had grown accustomed to every door opening, every voice silencing, every space rearranging itself to accommodate his arrival. He spoke briefly to Madame Folick, his words too low for Amara to hear from where she stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, but whatever he said caused Madame Folick's face to cycle through several shades of red before settling on a forced smile of obsequious cooperation. Then Chief Adeyemi turned, and his eyes found Amara across the courtyard. And in that moment, she saw something she had not expected to see in the face of a man known for his ruthlessness, uncertainty, vulnerability, something almost like hope. He walked toward her, and Madame Folick started to follow, but he raised a hand without looking back, a gesture that stopped her as effectively as a wall. And suddenly it was just Chief Adeyemi and Amara standing in the servants' corridor that smelled of cleaning products and old cooking oil. Two people from completely different worlds, connected by a thread of fate they were only beginning to understand. They sat in Amara's tiny room because Chief Adeyemi insisted. He wanted privacy, he said. True privacy, not the performative kind that happened in formal sitting rooms, where servants hovered and social hierarchies were maintained through furniture arrangements. Zara had been sent to play outside, under the watchful eye of one of the security men, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with his assignment of babysitting a 7-year-old, who kept asking him questions about his gun. Chief Adeyemi sat on the single wooden chair, his large frame making it look like children's furniture, while Amara perched on the edge of her bed, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he said, his voice stripped of its earlier authority and carrying instead a raw honesty that made him sound younger than his years. I had my people investigate after I received your message. I pulled every record from that night, tracked down the ambulance crew, found the police report that mentioned an unknown woman who had been at the scene. I even found the officer who took statements, and he remembered you, said you were young, calm, covered in my blood, and that you disappeared before anyone could get your full name. He paused, and Amara watched his hands, those hands that signed billion-naira contracts and wielded power over thousands of employees, clasped together in something that looked like prayer. The doctor said, I would have died if I had lost any more blood before help arrived. He said whoever stopped the bleeding saved my life. Amara nodded slowly, remembering the weight of that night, the feel of his pulse under her fingers, the prayer she had whispered over and over. Please, God, don't let him die. Don't let me fail. Because even then, even as a student barely more than a child herself, she had understood the sacred responsibility of holding someone's life in your hands. I never wanted recognition, she said softly. I did what anyone should do, what I was training to do. And then life happened, and I couldn't finish my training, and here I am, cleaning houses instead of helping people heal. But that doesn't change what happened that night. I saved you because it was right, not because I expected anything in return. Chief Adeyemi studied her face, as if trying to read something written there, in a language he had forgotten. And then he said the words that changed everything. I need you to save me again. The explanation took nearly an hour, and Amara listened with growing disbelief as Chief Adeyemi laid bare his mortality in a way she suspected he had done with very few people. The rare blood disorder, the 6-month prognosis, the exhaustive search that had turned up nothing, the cruel irony of having unlimited resources but being unable to purchase the one thing he needed. He had been calling what he thought was his last hope when Zara had answered the phone. But now he saw it differently, not as a wrong number, but as fate's deliberate intervention, a cosmic correction steering him back to the person who had already saved him once. But the story grew more complicated when his doctor arrived. Dr. Ibrahim, an elderly house imam with kind eyes, who carried a medical bag that looked like it had accompanied him through decades of practice. The doctor had been doing research, had accessed Amara's old medical records from her university health clinic through connections and permissions that Chief Adeyemi's money had facilitated, and what he had discovered made them all fall silent. Amara had the rare blood type. She was a perfect match. But there was more, and Dr. Ibrahim delivered this news with the gentle gravity of someone who understood. He was speaking words that would ripple outward for years. Zara, because of the particular genetic lottery of her parentage, was an even rarer universal match, the kind that appeared in medical journals as statistical near impossibilities. If Amara could not donate for any health reason, if something went wrong, Zara represented a backup option. Though the doctor was quick to emphasize that using a child donor was a last resort, something that carried risks and ethical complications they would do everything to avoid. The room seemed to shrink around this revelation, the air growing dense with the weight of impossible choices and interconnected destinies. Amara looked at her daughter playing outside, visible through the small window, her laughter floating in on the afternoon breeze, and felt the vertigo of holding not just her own decision, but somehow being responsible for this powerful man's life. This man who had been a stranger twice, saved by her hands. This man who represented everything her world was not. Wealth, influence, the kind of power that could crush or elevate with equal ease. Amara agreed to donate, and she made this choice not in a moment of dramatic declaration, but quietly, inevitably, the way water finds its level, because saying no would have been denying something fundamental about who she was and who she had always tried to be, even when life had stripped away almost everything else. But the simplicity of that decision was immediately complicated by the machinery of Chief Adeyemi's world, grinding into motion around it. Within hours, lawyers appeared with documents, hospital administrators scheduled procedures, and news began to leak, because secrets are impossible to keep when dozens of people are involved, and when a billionaire's movements are tracked by business rivals and media outlets, hungry for any glimpse into the private lives of the powerful. Madame Folake, suddenly realizing that her disposable housemaid was connected to Chief Adeyemi in a way that conferred status and attention, performed an elaborate reversal, suddenly claiming she had always valued Amara, had always seen her potential, had never seriously meant that dismissal. But her efforts at reputation salvage came too late, because other forces were already moving. Someone, they would never know who, though suspicions pointed toward business rivals who saw opportunity in Chief Adeyemi's vulnerability, began spreading rumors to the media. The story that emerged in tabloids and whispered through Lagos social circles was ugly and predictable. A desperate housemaid had fabricated a connection to a dying billionaire, was trying to exploit his medical crisis for money, had probably put her own daughter at risk through this elaborate con. The narrative fit too perfectly into existing prejudices about class and poverty, and the supposed moral failings of those who lived on society's margins. Within 48 hours, Amara went from invisible servant to public spectacle, her face appearing in newspapers alongside speculation and character assassination. Reporters calling Madame Folake's residence at all hours. Photographers camping outside, trying to get pictures of the scheming maid and her exploited daughter. Chief Adeyemi's corporate reputation began to suffer by association, and whispers started circulating among the European investors. If Ogunlade's judgment was so compromised that he could be taken in by an obvious fraud, could they trust him with a billion-dollar partnership? The surgery was scheduled for Monday, but by Friday evening, the situation had deteriorated so badly that Dr. Ibrahim warned it might be impossible to proceed, that the media circus and legal threats had created an environment too toxic for the delicate medical procedure they needed to perform. The weekend before the scheduled transfusion felt like waiting for a verdict in a trial, where the rules kept changing and no one could agree on the charges. Amara stayed inside with Zara, ignoring the phone calls and the knocks on the door, trying to shield her daughter from the ugliness while also preparing her for the possibility that they would have to leave Lagos, return to the village in disgrace, start over with even less than they had before. Chief Adeyemi, against his lawyer's advice, had moved Amara and Zara into a secure wing of a private hospital where they could be protected from media harassment. And on Saturday evening, he came to visit them, looking more exhausted than Amara had yet seen him, the weight of his empire suddenly visible in the slope of his shoulders. "I can make this go away," he told Amara, speaking with the kind of defeat that comes from recognizing the limits of power. "I can pay them all off, buy their silence, make the story disappear. But it will take time. Weeks, probably. Maybe months. And I don't have months." Amara sat very still, Zara asleep in the hospital bed beside her. The child's hand curled trustingly in her mother's, and she thought about all the times she had swallowed injustice because fighting back seemed impossible, all the humiliations she had endured because survival required silence, all the ways poverty had taught her to make herself smaller and quieter and less visible. But this was different. This time silence meant death, for a man who, whatever his flaws, had shown her more basic human respect in 3 days than Madame Folklore had managed in 3 years. This time silence meant teaching Zara that truth could be defeated by lies if the lies were loud enough and came from people with more power. "No," Amara said, and her voice carried a strength that surprised them both. "We proceed as planned. Let them say what they want. I know what's true. You know what's true. God knows what's true. That's enough." But it was Zara who delivered the moment that would shift everything. On Sunday morning, a television crew managed to get into the hospital lobby, and in the chaos of security trying to remove them, Zara slipped away from the nurse watching her and walked straight up to a camera. Her 7-year-old face, serious in a way that children's faces should never have to be serious, and she spoke with the devastating clarity that only children possess before the world teaches them to calculate and self-censor. "My mama saved that man a long time ago, when I wasn't even born yet," Zara said, looking directly into the camera lens with those enormous eyes that seemed to contain multitudes. She never told anyone because she didn't need anyone to know. She just did it because that's what good people do. And now, everyone is saying she's bad and lying. But I know my mama. I know her better than all of you. She gives me her food when there's not enough. She works so hard her hands hurt. At night, she prays for people who are mean to her. And now, she's going to help that man again. And you're all trying to stop her. Because you don't understand what love is. You don't understand that some people just do good things without wanting money or being on TV or any of that stuff. My mama is like that. And if you don't believe her, then you don't understand anything about anything." The security guard reached her then, gently steering her away from the camera. But the damage, or perhaps the healing, was already done. The clip was online within minutes, shared thousands of times within the hour, and suddenly the narrative began to shift. Something about a child's absolute conviction, her unadorned truth-telling, cut through the cynicism and calculation that had defined the story until that moment. People began asking different questions. What kind of society attacks a woman for trying to save a life? When did helping someone become grounds for suspicion? Why were we so ready to believe the worst about someone simply because she was poor? By Sunday evening, the tide of public opinion had turned, and with it came a flood of support. Offers from other potential donors coming forward to be tested, legal advocates volunteering to protect Amara from the harassment, religious leaders speaking about the moral imperative to support acts of genuine altruism. Chief Adeyemi, watching the clip from his hospital room, where he had been admitted for pre-surgical preparation, wept openly for the first time since his own mother's funeral 30 years ago, because Zara's words had articulated something he had lost touch with decades earlier. The simple radical power of goodness, undertaken without calculation or expectation of reward. That night, he called his children in London and New York and tried to explain to them what he was learning about wealth and worth, about the difference between the empire he had built and the legacy he wanted to leave, though he could hear in their polite responses that they did not yet understand, that perhaps they would need their own encounters with mortality before these lessons could penetrate. The transfusion took place on Monday morning in a surgical suite that had been secured like a military installation, and though Amara was unconscious for the procedure itself, she was told afterward that it had gone perfectly, her blood flowing into Chief Adeyemi's veins, carrying with it not just the cellular components he needed to survive, but also something more intangible, a kind of grace that medical textbooks do not have language to describe. She woke in recovery to find Zara sitting beside her bed, drawing pictures of angels and talking to a nurse about whether heaven had playgrounds. And Amara's first thought was gratitude that her daughter had been spared having to donate, that she could remain exactly what she was, a child, innocent, unburdened by adult responsibilities and medical interventions. Chief Adeyemi recovered quickly, his body accepting the transfusion without complications, and in the weeks that followed, he began a systematic dismantling and rebuilding of his life that astonished everyone who knew him. He did not simply pay Amara money, though he ensured she would never know financial insecurity again. He did something more profound and more difficult. He listened to her. He asked her what she needed, what she had lost, what dreams she had deferred, and then he set about trying to restore not just material stability, but dignity and possibility. A foundation was established in Amara's name to train rural first responders and provide scholarships for nursing students who could not afford to complete their education. Zara was enrolled in one of Lagos's best schools, with funding guaranteed through university. Amara herself was offered a position managing the foundation, work that required her organizational skills and her intimate understanding of what it meant to fall through society's cracks, work that paid her not as a servant, but as a professional. And perhaps most significantly, Chief Adeyemi helped Amara reconnect with her family in the village, people she had been too ashamed to face after her fall from student to housemaid, people who welcomed her back with tears and ululations when they saw she had not only survived, but somehow transformed her suffering into something that would help others. The $1 billion oil deal was delayed by 3 months while Chief Adeyemi recovered. But when it finally closed, he stood before the international investors and told them that the delay had taught him something more valuable than any contract, that the greatest investment any person can make is in recognizing and honoring the goodness of those whom society has taught us to overlook. As for Madame Folak, karma visited her not with dramatic vengeance, but with something more subtle and devastating. A slow erosion of her social standing, as people quietly stopped inviting her to their events, stopped seeking her opinion, stopped pretending that cruelty wrapped in expensive clothing was anything other than poverty of spirit. 3 years later, when Amara stood in her modest but beautiful home in a quiet Lagos neighborhood, watching Zara get ready for the entrance exam that would determine her secondary school placement, she thought about that phone call and how a child's innocent action had set in motion a series of events that defied probability and exceeded imagination. The narrator's voice, were it to speak over this scene, might sound like the voice of the ancestors themselves, deep and resonant and tinged with the kind of wisdom that comes from observing generations of human folly and grace. In the end, the call that seemed like a mistake was destiny's most careful design, a thread connecting past salvation to future redemption, proving that goodness is never wasted, never forgotten, never unrewarded by the universe that keeps accounts more carefully than any banker. Chief Adeyemi learned that the greatest wealth is not accumulated in vaults, but invested in the hearts of those who give, without counting the cost. And Amara learned that the lowest valley can become the highest mountain if you refuse to surrender your integrity in the darkness. And as for little Zara, who had answered a phone that was not meant for her, and spoken truth that wasn't diminished by her youth, she learned that even the smallest voice can carry the weight of destiny when it speaks from a foundation of love. The ancestors say this, and it has been true since the first fire was lit and the first story was told. A single act of kindness can bend the future, and even the smallest hand can hold the thread that saves a king. Never forget, life always rewards the pure in heart, though the reward may come disguised as catastrophe before it reveals itself as grace, And the path from tragedy to triumph is often walked by those who never sought the journey, but refused to abandon their humanity when the walking grew difficult. This is the story of a billionaire who discovered he was poor, and a maid who learned she was rich, and between them stood a child whose innocence reminded them both that the truest currency in this world is not gold or power, but the courage to answer when destiny calls, even when the voice on the other end sounds nothing like you expected.